Has to be incognito.
Volume 5.
Microwaves.
Microwaves. May one use a microwave for both meat and dairy? Microwaves share a number of similarities to standard ovens, but they're also different. On one hand, microwaves heat food by causing the water molecules present in the food to become warm, which creates much more zaya, which we talked about last time, than in a regular oven, especially given the fact that microwaves are smaller and the steam is more concentrated. On the other hand, the walls of a microwave oven are made out of plastic and usually do not get very hot, which means that they may absorb less flavor of the food, and therefore there may be less concern of basar b'chala. Given these considerations, should microwave ovens be equivalent to regular ovens? Should one treat a microwave in the same manner halachically as one treats the oven? Based on the 4 approaches that we had last week, whether you can cook right away, whether you have to wait a period of time, whether you have to heat it up, or according to the last opinion, you have to have 2 complete different ovens. According to many poskim, ideally one should use a microwave for either meat or dairy only. Even Rav Shechter, who was more lenient concerning a regular oven. Remember, Rav Shechter said you could cook in a meat oven immediately after a milk oven or vice versa. Here he states that one must be more stringent with a microwave due to the increased amount of zayah that is produced. But Rav Melamed cites a minority of poskim, including Rav Nachum Rabinovitz and Rav Halberstam, who hold that there's no necessity for covering or separating between meat and dairy.
Which Rav Halberstam is he talking about even?
I do not know.
But Rav Halberstam, the other one, Rabinovich, passed away like 2 weeks ago.
Right, the Siach Nachum.
Yeah.
Who hold that, I don't know which Rav Halberstam. There's a Rav Halberstam who wrote the Divrei Chaim, who comes to visit Los Angeles. I'm in touch with him. I don't know if it's that Rav Halberstam. We'll have to find out.
There's a lot.
Huh?
There are a lot of Rav Halberstams.
Right.
A lot.
Who hold that there's no necessity for covering or separating between meat and dairy, as they feel the level of steam in a microwave is not sufficiently problematic. But that's a minority opinion. Although the walls of a microwave remain cold often, since the food can get very hot and a large amount of steam reaches the walls, absorption may occur, plus food splatter frequently against the walls. For this reason, the Sefer HaKashrus recommends covering all meat or dairy foods placed in a microwave. And then one may also kasher the microwave in between uses by cleaning it well, waiting 24 hours, and heating up a cup of water inside. If one wishes to use the microwave for both meat and dairy, the Sefer HaKashrus suggests the following guidelines. Taner microgal ragil, that's a regular microwave, hamashamish ach v'rak lahafsharat mazon o chimumo, which means this microwave is being used only to heat up food. It's not used to cook food, like to defrost it or to reheat. Yesha material lishtamish bo l'chalavi u'levesari l'chilufin. Means you can use the same microwave for milk and dairy, not at the same time, but sequentially. Bitnai shamaychel atuf hermetit, as long as it's hermetically sealed. Ve'eno munach yeshirut al gabi hatzalachat. It's not placed directly on the microwave dish that sits there and spins around. Ubeparva nitin lishtamesh l'lo kisu. Part of things can be done without covering.
Bernie, why is the spinning plate a problem if it's made of Pyrex glass?
No, because you don't want to use the same plate to put, he's talking about putting something meat.
I'm talking about the plate on which you put that it rotates around as it warms the food. Right. It's a permanent fixture in there.
Yeah, but you cannot put something directly on that plate. Bert, you can't put a food item directly on that plate because then the plate's going to absorb whatever, you're going to have a problem.
It has to be in another pot or a dish.
Has to be on another. First of all, we remove those things from our microwaves because we have separate ones. But what I'm saying is we take out those dishes. But even if you have that dish in there, you can't put food directly on that dish. You got to put it on another plate. Otherwise, if you put a meat thing on that plate and then you'd have a problem with the meat and milk. Wouldn't work. It would work if you put something parv there, and all you use the microwave is for something parv, then you could put it on the plate. Here he's talking about if you want to use the microwave for both meat and milk, you can't put anything directly on that plate. Some people use a fleshik microwave and a milchtik microwave. That's our custom. It's just easier in the kitchen. Occasionally, you can use a vice versa microwave if you make sure that the walls are clean. If you want to go through heating up a cup of water in there until the water is boiling, you can use that as well. Cleaning it, waiting 24 hours, and heating it up is another mechanism of using the same microwave. Rav Forst in Laws of Kashrus presents similar guidelines in using a microwave for meat and dairy, as does Rav Melamed, who also allows heating either meat or dairy uncovered on a regular basis because he claims that it doesn't get that hot, and covering only the other type when heating. That means it depends. If it's a dedicated meat one, you can use the meat one uncovered regularly. And then if you're going to cook something milch there, then you cover that one. The same thing like we said about the regular oven. Rav Melamed adds that in his opinion, small holes in the cover does not transfer sufficient steam to render the microwave trafe, and certainly not for steam to enter the food that is being covered. And apparently Rav Hershel Schachter is reported to rule the same way. So for the same reasons, a microwave found in a public location, let's say at an office or any public location, you go to a hotel, there's a microwave oven in your room. So those all should be treated as non-kosher, unless all of those who use it are careful to use it for only kosher meat or dairy food. Now, one who wishes to use such a microwave should cover the food with two coverings to ensure that absolutely no non-kosher steam or flavor is absorbed by one's food. That's the same practice used on airplanes when heating up kosher meals. They use a microwave. It's not a kosher microwave, but it's got two seals. So therefore, that's permitted. Although the meals are heated in a small non-kosher oven, they are packaged by the kosher care with two seals around them to prevent potential absorption. Now, what is the halacha if a microwave was mistakenly used improperly, such as heating food in a non-kosher microwave without any cover, or you had a microwave that was only used for dairy and you put meat food in there which was uncovered? Does the microwave or the food become non-kosher? This question is subject to different opinions among the poskim, depending on their approach to some of the questions that we addressed above. Although some are stringent and recommend koshering the microwave and not eating the food, Rav Melamed is lenient. B'di'evet, says Rav Melamed, in Pninei Halacha. He's a Mizrahi Rav in Eretz Yisrael today, but a known halachist. He's written the Pninei Halacha. B'di'evet im chimumu v'lo kisur kanidrash. If it was not heated up with a cover, he says a Michael kosher, because you can see he was of the Shita. He's consistent that the microwave doesn't get very hot, and that there's no problem with Zeya. So he's consistent. The imgam lo hayta hafrada bein ha'ma'achal tzalach. Even if there was no separation between the food and the plate, v'yitachen shatzalachat hayta meluchlechet ma'at. Now, if that plate was dirty, b'shar Michael treif. O me'aminyan hasheni, of course, on Michael she'mechol tzalachas hazeh no kosher. So that food would be treif, and that's why you really shouldn't put anything directly on that plate. Okay, any comments, questions? Okay, let's move on to dishwashers, page 42. Is it permitted to use a dishwasher for both meat and dairy? Regarding this modern appliance, poskim have disputed the parameters as to how they may be used. Some poskim are more lenient, based on considerations that emerge from the following case in Shulchan Aruch. Says Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah Tzadikei, Yirali, not nu efer b'mayim chamim, should be Yoreh. Let's say in the times of the Shulchan Aruch, they would have a big cauldron that they would heat with hot water, and they would clean their dishes in such a cauldron. So the Shulchan Aruch is saying, if they put ashes into the water that's being heated by this cauldron, before they would, here the question is, what if they put meat and milk dishes in that cauldron at the same time? Is there, because the water is hot, does it induce transfer of flavors between the dishes and trafe up the dishes? So the Shulchan Aruch says if they put ashes into the water, and even though there's not even blios, we're not talking about absorbed flavors in the dish, which remember we've been learning tam ke'ikr. Doesn't make a difference whether there's ikr food there or even the flavor. The flavor is treated like the ikr item. But here the Shulchan Aruch is warning us that even if there was fatty residue on these plates, one of milk, one of meat, mutter. Our old friend Noisen Tam Lifgam. Since by putting ashes in this cauldron, it's going to give a bad flavor, then it's all, the taste is ruined and there's no taste. So according to Shulchan Aruch, the ashes have the ability to ruin the taste of the food, such that any basar b'chol that mixed within the large pot will not be rendered forbidden due to this principle of Nosen Tam Lifgam. Remember, if you have a plate that's more than 24 hours old, it's after 24 hours, the flavor in the plate is considered that it goes lifgam. So we learned that even if you have a fleshik plate, but it's not ben yomo, it's beyond 24 hours, and you put macaroni and cheese on that fleshik plate, that macaroni and cheese you can eat. L'chol hadayos. We have a din that you have to kasher that plate, migzera, as a low plug. But the flavor is lifgam, and therefore there's no basar v'cholav. We're using the same principle. Rav Shulchan Aruch is using the same principle here by putting ashes into the cauldron. However, the Shach and the Taz disagreed with the Shulchan Aruch, which they do often. Din ze lo nimtza b'shum posek, v'lo shum echad ma'achronim hizkiruhu. The Shach said he never saw this in any posek. He never saw this in any of the achronim after the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, the Shach is one of the major, he's one of the early achronim. And anybody after the Shulchan Aruch, from the time of Yosef Karo, who is lived in about 1500 in Tzfat, the Shulchan Aruch is the last Rishon. And anybody after him is the Achronim. So the Ramah is like the first generation of the Achronim. But an early Achron, he was in Krakow in 1550. Right now we're in the period of the Achronim. So for example, the modern Achronim are considered to be started by the Noida B'Yehuda, the Chassam Sofer, in 1800. And everybody after that is considered the later Achronim. So, but everybody before, Rabbi Akiva Eger is an early Achron, sort of in the bridge, because he's like 1760, 1770.
Do we even have Achronim now, Ernie?
Of course we do. Rav Moshe is an Achron.
No, but do we have Achronim left or alive? We have no Achronim.
Oh, well, of course of course. Any of the great, we are still in the period of the Achronim.
They become Achronim afterwards,
Say it again.
right? After they die, they become Achronim.
But Rav Moshe was alive, was an Achron. I mean, if you're the Posek Hador in our generation, in every generation, they're going to be, unless, as Chaim says, maybe they're going to create a new terminology.
The reality is that with Moshe Feinstein, he was a recognized Achron everywhere. We don't really have today a recognized Posek that is followed by and large by the majority of Jews.
Okay, but maybe Shlomo Zalman was you could say was the last Achron, and then you'll make it maybe Rav Elyashiv. I mean, you're right. Certainly, Rav Moshe was a consensus Posek, and maybe there's going to be a new term called post Achron, but that we have not. I'm not sure we've lived through that yet. But let's certainly, currently, everyone who is the posek would be considered in the Achronim. But there is a separation between what we call early Achronim, which I've just discussed, and the later Achronim. Okay, it's interesting that the Shach discusses there's no Achronim. Hiskiru gam beis Yosef lo hiskiru. He says, remember, the Beis Yosef was Rav Yosef Karo, and he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shach is warning us that he never heard the Beis Yosef in his comments on the tour mention this issue regarding the Efer Amayim. Adirab, says the Shach. Mashma midivrei aposkim de ein shum takona lahagil kli ben yomo im lo sheyesh b'mayim samech neged hakli. So this cauldron is a ben yomo, let's say milk kli or fleshik kli. So what the Shulchan Aruch said is, if you throw bad taste of Afer into the cauldron, you can't convert it to a non-ben yomo kli. I don't know why not. Well, I mean, I don't understand the Shach well here. I mean, livgam is livgam is livgam is livgam. What do we care if it became livgam because it's beyond ben yomo, or if the flavor is a terrible livgam? They put soap, detergent, or ashes in a ben yomo kli. I don't understand the Shach's objection to the concept. He says he doesn't understand why you can have a takana lahagil kli ben yomo. Im lo sheyesh b'mayim samech neged hakli. Of course, he follows the general principle. If there's 60 times as much water in that cauldron than in the blias of the kli, then you wipe away that blia. And we never have. Remember, we learned we never have enough water like that, except if you're dealing with a very, very wide and narrow pan. There we said that maybe in that situation, but in general, we never say that there's enough mayim in a kli, shishim beyond the blia in the kli. So the Shach rejects this concept of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Piskei Tshuva answers that this may not be a true case of nois and dam lifgam, but rather the ashes prevent the meat and dairy from mixing together in a manner that would create basar b'chol. Says the Piskei Tshuva, Nira she'en kavonas ha'mechaber de'efer yachol lifgam et ha'isur. The kavanah of the mechaber is not that the bad taste it creates a pgam of the isur. Ela kavanah so dafka hacha the basar b'chol of mahani efer lahaklish tam. It weakens the flavor shelo yichol alav achar kach shein basar b'chol. Says the footnote. In addition to this resolution of Piskei Tshuva, numerous achronim rule in accordance with the Shulchan Aruch against the Shach, as cited by Rav Ovadia elsewhere in the Tshuva that we're going to learn. In addition, Rav Ovadia and others hold that even if ashes are not necessarily nois and tam lifgam, most cleaning agents today are strong enough that all opinions would agree that they do render any taste impotent. Indeed, the notion of nois and tam lifgam is widely accepted today as a legitimate leniency, at least b'di'evet. So based on this, Rav Ovadia, so we really, in this sugya, we're really seeing a nice glimpse in how the halacha has developed. We see the Shulchan Aruch, we see the Shach's opposition to it, and we see how the Pischei Tshuva tries to resolve it. And based on this, Rav Ovadia rules leniently that since a dishwasher usually contains soap that ruins the taste of whatever's inside, one may use it to wash meat and dairy dishes even simultaneously, like what the Shulchan Aruch said. Because I explained to you, the Shulchan Aruch there, the sugya in Sadik Hey Dalet is talking about in the times of the, in 1600s, they would wash dishes in these big cauldrons and they would mix milk and meat in it. And this was a solution that Shulchan Aruch said. So the Rav Ovadia takes it literally. And therefore you can wash meat and dairy dishes simultaneously. Though he recommends trying to wash them consecutively, not at the same time. Says the Abiyah Omer, Rav Ovadia certainly is an Achron because the Sfardim rely completely on Ovadia Yosef. All the Sfardim today, like the way the Ashkenazim treated Rav Moshe, the Sfardim treat Ovadia Yosef, period. No question, he may be the final Achron for them, or other Achronim that will come out. So, Afkan Shamaim Shemedichim Bayam Esakelim, Mu'urav Bayam Avkat Sabon. Since in the dishwashers there's detergent, Ushar Chomrei Nikui Charifim, other cleansing agents that are very charif. The Noistin Tam Livgam B'Mayim U'V'Kelim. They give a soapy detergent flavor in the water and the kelim. Mutter ladiach klibasur klecholav afil b'vasachas mediach kelim. He says it straight out. Ki alach ravachasi shnois atam livgam mutter. Maskona de dina sheyesh laharos heter b'mediach kelim leklebasur klecholav afilu biyacha. V'rak mios tov echa de efsher yesh ladiach klibasur lechud klecholav lechud b'zachar zeh. He says it's certainly better to wash the dishes sequentially, not necessarily at the same time, but he says it's certainly okay. Rav Moshe disagreed and held that one may not use the same dishwasher for both meat and dairy dishes, even when they are not washed simultaneously. Hinek far katafti b'sifrei Igros Moshe, Chelik Orachayim Semel Kuf Daled, Shema shebetoch hadishwasher. He says you should have at least two sets of racks. He says, even though I'm recommending that what you actually put the dishes on, i.e. the racks, they have to be different racks. Because it's possible there might be a residue of food and fat. If you use the same rack, the meat residue is going to touch the dairy plate and ipcha, vice versa. And then when the dishwasher brings in water that is clearly yatsoletisbo, so the meat kli will absorb the chalav and vice versa. You can't rely on the water that it's going to get rid of the residue. It's there. People are quick. They don't look at the rack very carefully. Even somebody who is going to be careful, he might forget. So you need certainly at least two racks. And Rav Moshe is probably also worried about the sides of the dishwasher as well, that there's going to be residue, etc. However, in the continuation of the same tshuva as well as in the tshuva below, Rav Moshe does clarify the possibility of using the dishwasher for meat and dairy consecutively if one switches the racks. So another tshuva seems to suggest that you could use the same dishwasher itself, right, the house of the dishwasher, as long as you change the racks. Uvidvara kliya chadasha, this new appliance, l'rachetzes hakelim shenikra b'shem dishwasher, im yicholim lirchot sham klei basar klei chalav zachar zeh, He was asked, can you wash milk and dairy plates one after another consecutively? Again, he's referring to the racks. The item that you put the kelim directly on has to be separate. You need to have different racks. But etzema dishwasher, the box that you put the racks in, shehu rak hadefanot, just the walls. So he says that the dishwasher itself could be the same dishwasher, you just have to use different racks. So now we have two shitas. We have the Rav Ovadia, who says you can wash meat and milk together, but certainly he would advocate doing them separately, and you don't have to change the racks according to Rav Ovadia. We have Rav Moshe, who says you could use the same dishwasher, but you should not wash them together. And then when you wash them separately, you should have different racks. Comes the Badei HaShulchan. The Badei HaShulchan we talked about last week. He's alive today in Borough Park. He's the major commentary on Yoredeya that we use when you study Yoredeya, you use the Badei HaShulchan. He's like the Mishnah Brura, right? The Badei HaShulchan, though, is more stringent than Rav Moshe. Does not allow switching the racks due to potential absorption of basar v'chala by the walls of the dishwasher. Aval pu'ulata mechonit, right? The machine, ilafazra amayim, elu b'cha ve'elu b'cha, right? That the machine sprays water here and there. B'shas hitzatein, I guess while it's being sprayed, the leka shishim ba'os matipim, there's not enough water shishim against the hamalichim es pirei basar l'klei chalav, against the blios that are there. So he says you should have a separate dishwasher for meat and a separate dishwasher for milk. So that's three approaches. Another approach to this question is offered by Rav Mordechai Eliyahu that the Hakashos Halacha quotes. V'yesh makilim b'mechonal l'shtifat kelim baitit, a house dishwasher, to wash milk and meat dishes consecutively. This is what he says to do. You got to clean where the filter is and make sure that there's no residue in the filter. And he says you should try to change the racks, although he doesn't say absolutely change them. He says, if you can't change them, at least you should wash them very carefully. And then he says, Lahamtin 24 shows. Then he throws something in that Rav Moshe didn't throw in, I guess because Rav Moshe said you could use different racks. So if you use different racks, you don't have to wait. But if you have the same rack, Rav Eliyahu is saying to wait 24 hours. And then he says you should turn on the dishwasher with hot water and soap before you use it as a dishwasher. Because then that sort of washes everything good. It will also, whatever residue is there now is going to be lifgam because of the detergent. So, and that way, you don't put the dishes in there while the residue might still be in there. He says if you don't have any other breira, just clean it very well, get rid of the filter, and then use water and soap before you put the dishes in. Since this issue is quite complex, many dishwashers do not operate exactly in the same manner, plus significant controversy exists among contemporary poskim regarding these issues. It's recommended to discuss the particulars of the case with one's rabbi. I'm going to read the footnotes here. Rav 4 states that Rav Moshe does not seem to have considered the question of the filter, where actual meat or residue may occasionally accumulate from previous cycles and potentially cause transfer of taste to the dishes of the other type. Rav Forst himself believes that that's a serious issue, but suggests that perhaps Rav Moshe did not mention it because filters were uncommon in his time, or because he felt that the water contained 60 parts the volume of the food residue in the filter. Nowadays, it's possible that some filters do not have this problem, but it's not certain because there are many different dishwashers that operate in different ways. Then they say, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's opinion is not accepted by the majority of poskim. Even his son, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, is only lenient in washing dishes one after the other, but not at the same time. In addition, Rav Ovadia does not appear to consider the reality that in many dishwashers, the soap is not added until after hot water has already been sprayed. If so, any potential problem of mixing or absorption of basar b'chalav may already have occurred before the soap can provide the leniency of noisen tam lifkam. On the other hand, even Rav Moshe's somewhat more stringent ruling does not appear to focus on the question of the filter, where food residue sometimes is found much later. Many poskim take a strict approach that one should never use a dishwasher for both meat and dairy in any form, including Rav Elyashiv and Rav Vosner. In addition, it is possible that there are differences between the method of operation of dishwashers manufactured in the United States and European models used in Israel that might have affected the psak of the Israeli poskim. And he gives you a source called the Dishwasher Debate and if you want to read it in Hebrew, Tchumim, by Rav Rosen, Rav Pearl. Now, there are differing opinions concerning the halacha if one did use a dishwasher for meat and dairy simultaneously. According to Rav Ovadia, one may obviously be lenient. In the Hebrew version of the Tzurba Rabbana, the following guidelines are suggested. If the dishes were ben yomo, then you need to kasher the dishes by running them through a dishwashing cycle. As for the dishwasher, one should clean it well, wait 24 hours, and then run the dishwasher through an empty cycle with the hottest water possible. If the dishes were not ben yomo, that means they were beyond 24 hours, everything is permitted. Other poskim, such as Rav Spitz, are lenient, even though they do not adopt Rav Ovadia's lenient position as lachatchila. Nevertheless, since there are many uncertainties, they agree that there's room to be lenient in a b'diavad case. It means if someone did it, after the fact. Okay, any comments, questions? Okay. Let's go to page 46. We dealt before with ovens. Now we're going to deal with stoves. The burners that are, the stovetop burners. Stovetop with burners is also a cooking device. As opposed to ovens, most people do not have two sets of burners. They have one stovetop with 4 burners. May one use all of the burners on the stovetop for both meat and dairy, or must you designate some of the burners for meat and the others for dairy? We saw a ruling by the Ramah before concerning 2 pots that are hot, right? One was meat and one was dairy that touch each other. You have a pan that's covered. So we said, let's say there's a pot, a fleshik pot below it, and there's steam rising from the fleshik pot. So if the machvat is covered, I call shari. It's all permitted. It's no worse than midid havi ashtei kderos nogo zu bezu. It's certainly better than 2 hot pots that touch each other. They ain't ostrim et zed zebenigia. They don't aser. You need fluid to transfer blias, and here there's no fluid. 2 hot pots that touch each other, and certainly koshekin b'zeh that are not touching. So you should be careful that they shouldn't touch, etc. But the evidence, it's not a problem. So according to Ramah, 2 hot pots that touch cannot transfer meat or dairy taste from one to the other without liquid. We're assuming that they're not moist on the outside. So too with regard to a stovetop burner. Even if some meat spilled on the burner, the absorbed taste cannot be transferred later to a dairy pot placed on the burner without a liquid medium. And although the Ramah recommends being machmir lechatchila, a stove is more lenient, since one can assume that everything that's spilled will be burned immediately thereafter by the fire before the next pot is placed there. Therefore, it should be permitted to use the same burner for both meat and dairy. This conclusion is evident from a ruling of the Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah concerning the laws of kashering, which we're going to learn in detail later on in volume 5. The Ramah writes that a chatzuva requires libun, kashering by placing on fire. That's what the Ramah.
Ernie, would the same apply to a barbecue? You have the same thing. You have grills on which food can splatter.
Yeah, but there the food is put directly. See, here the food is not being placed in a pot. It's being placed on the. He's talking about pieces of meat that fall off into the oven. Excuse me, into this cooking element, the burner, and then the burner burns it up. You're not now. If you put food directly on the burner, you'd have a problem.
Right.
You wouldn't have a problem beyond 24 hours.
It's the same with the barbecue.
And it could be that the fire, that's what they're saying here, is like libun gomer, and it burns everything away out. So, but the problem with a barbecue is you put the food directly on that grill.
But the burner's beneath the grill. If there's food splattered on that, you assume that it'll be
That would burn away.
fire.
Yeah, that would be the same din
Right.
as the burner.
Okay.
That burns away. So what's a chatzuva? Because the Mishnah Berurah says a chatzuva requires libun. Hu kli sheyesh la gimel regalim umamid malei k'deira o machmas betoner ala or kol hasham. It sounds like a cookout, or the cowboys used to have like a tripod. 3 metal sticks. You had a fire below it, and they would put a pot on the tripod. That's what he says a chatzuva is. The imrotze lishtamish bo bepesach. Now, let's say they wanted to use that on Pesach. Tzarech lelavna ba'or. You needed livun. You needed to take a torch and turn it white hot. Sometimes the food in the pot will have spilled on this tripod. V'nivla batam chametz al yedei ha'or, and it absorbs the flavor of chametz. V'zerak lechatchila mishum chumer de chametz. The only reason we require it lechatchila is because of the special stringency of chametz, which is aser b'mashu. There's a iser kares. The be'emesh teikteros hanogo zu bezu, right? The Mishnah Berurah is citing the Ramah that says when you have 2 pots that touch each other, ein yotzes habli mizu lezu. The flavors don't transfer. Kimavur b'yoredeya sim and tzadik beis, but gam yesh litlos. We can suppose sha'afim nishpach kvar nisra. Then he says if regular isra v'heter, whether it's basar, whether it's cholav or anything also that's not chametz, we can rely on the fact that it got burned up. It's not there. Because the fire is there all the time. So based on this Mishnah Berurah, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach rules that one may place meat and dairy pots on the same burners, not at the same time, as recorded in Halicha Shlomo. And that was the same opinion of Rav Moshe as well. You can cook on the same burner meat and milk. He says Rav Shlomo Zalman in his own house cooked meat and dairy on the same burner. So Rav Forst notes that although there's certainly room to be lenient, again, the issue is subject to dispute. Stove grates present less of a problem since the flame reaches the grates and presumably burns away any food residue. Therefore, some authorities, Rav Moshe, Rav Shlomo Zalman. That's more than some authorities. I'm surprised of the language that he used. Some authorities permit use of the same grades for both meat and dairy. However, one who notices any meat residue on a grate should remove it before placing on a dairy pot on that grate.
Excuse me, Ernie, that's the same as a barbecue. If you're using a grate on a stove, how is that different from the grill on a barbecue?
Where do you see a grate on the stove? With the grate
Grates.
is the grate is that metal thing that sits on top of your burner. You don't put food on that grate, Bernie. You put a pot on that grate.
Okay.
Now, some people, they'll take a marshmallow, right, and they'll burn a marshmallow on the grate. Or I've seen people take a what is that called? A tortilla. I'm just saying that could technically be a problem if there's meat residue there, etc. And there's also problems with chametz then. But here we're talking about putting the pot. You could put a milk pot and a dairy pot, a meat pot and milk pot on the same grate. But if you notice any meat residue, you should clean it. Electric stove range are permitted since the coils also burn away the food residue. Other authorities, he cites the Minchas Yitzchak, that's Dayan Weiss, who was the head of the Eda Charedis, questioned this practice and advised that one should keep separate grates for each type. And many follow this commendable custom. According to either opinion, the Sefer Kashrus notes that any food that falls onto the burners should be considered treif. Because of this problem that it could be meat and milk, and maybe there's some residue there. He says, Kirayim, Hamishamshos l'chalavi v'gam l'bsari, these stovetops that are being used for both milk and meat, yesh l'syaches l'chol chelkei hamishateach ha'elyon. So we have to treat the upper part of the grate as a non-kosher utensil, kli treifa. You should never put food directly on that grate. That answers Bernie's question. If some food fell out on it, can't eat it. Moreover, the Sefer Kashrus strongly urges one not to cook or fry dairy and meat foods on the stove simultaneously. So, right, if let's say you're cooking a meat dish on one stove grate burner, you shouldn't cook milk on the same time, because as if the pots or pans touch, there might be liquid on the outside of the pot, so the utensil could be rendered treif and the food could be rendered treif. So that's not a good idea. In addition, some hold that zayah can transfer flavor from one pot to another in this type of case. You should not cook or fry milk and meat things on the stovetops at the same time.
Doesn't it depend on the size of the stovetop and how far away they are?
I would agree with if it's extremely far apart, that's what he's talking about. They're worried about people. They're worried about people doing it right next to each other.
A lot of people have 6 burner, so where it's 2, 2, 2. So if they're working on one end, I mean, you're talking about something 2 feet apart, maybe? Absolutely.
He doesn't give. I think this is practical. It's practical common sense. That means if it's extremely far. But remember, when you're frying something, it can spatter, right? When you fry onions you're making an omelet, and you have olive oil in there, whatever, and it can spatter. So whatever. You just have to use common sense.
Okay.
Got to keep it distant. There's no real reason to do it at the same time. Rav Force stresses that the primary concern here is that using meat and dairy uncovered pots in close proximity may cause splattering from one to the other. He also notes that this follows the interpretation of the Shach, who interprets the statement of the Ramah, warning that l'chadchila one should not place a kosher pot cooking on the stove next to a non-kosher pot belonging to a Gentile for the same reason. the Taz understands the Ramah to be concerned about the possibility that the Gentile may switch the pots, but there's no concern of splatterings in case of meat and dairy. So there's machlokas Shach and Taz regarding that. Finally, Rav Forst notes that if one did place hot meat and dairy pots near each other, one need not assume b'di'evet that splattering occurred unless you saw it take place. So you see, Chaim, that really qualifies, the stringency here. Now, what about a hot plate? And with not just hot plate, but we're talking about the blech that you use to keep food warm on Shabbos. Another appliance that sometimes causes issue when using for both meat, there's a hot plate or a plata. Those who use the device for reheating cold food on Shabbat, right? It's got to be a davar gush. It can't be something solid. It can't be something liquid. You can't have chicken soup that's cold in your refrigerator and put it on the hot plate because that's liquid. It's got to be a davar gush, like a kugel. It's not moist, right? You can't even do it directly from the refrigerator. Most people let it go to room temperature before you put it on that, but it cannot be liquid. So if you reheat cold food on Shabbat, they'll often use it for meat dishes because on Shabbos, most people have fleischiks for meals. May one also use it for dairy on the occasion when you have a dairy meal. Many of us have dairy meals on Yom Tov for lunch, or certainly on Shavuos when you have dairy meal. The answer is that a hot plate that is usually used for meat should be classified as a meat utensil, since there are often spills of both solids and liquids on the hot plate. However, the Sefer Hora Berura, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch for the laws of Basar B'Challah, states that it may occasionally be used for dairy as well. It means as long as you're not doing it on a regular basis, it could, in Lushas HaTzorech, Muchel Aniyecha Plata Basarit, Gon Sheniech Aleh Shenitzel V'Chadome, Schnitzel, K'deirot Shel Chalav V'Chadome. Also, I see my wife, she has everything wrapped in a silver foil. It's not like you put the food directly on the hot plate. Isn't that correct?
We have silver foil.
I understand, but
pan with silver foil.
no, I understand, but here it seems like they're worried that people are putting schnitzel directly on it.
If you're a yeshiva guy, you put it straight on it.
You put it straight on it.
But Ernie, with a hot plate, it never gets that hot that you're cooking liquid.
Yeah, but it's Yatzoletispo.
liquid.
Yatzoletispo, Bernie, is 114 degrees.
Yeah, so with a hot plate, does it get that hot?
I think it does. You can't put your hand on. If you put your hand on it, it's Yatzoletis. Yatzoletispo means, the Hebrew means that you reflexly move your hand away.
Mm-hmm.
The hot plates get pretty hot.
No, I'm just worried from the point of view of splatter. There's very
also
little
hold-
splatter on a hot plate.
Well,
Anyway, you say you're not allowed to put liquids on there, so where's the splatter? There should
well,
be.
I guess if it's nearby, you got food nearby. Yes, you cannot reheat something liquid on the hot plate. But I guess they're worried that there's going to be liquid stuff around there. And as Sydney said, people do put meat directly on that hot plate. So, but if you don't do it on a regular basis, you can put k'der shel chalav v'chadom. Others, such as the Tosefet Halacha, suggest not relying on this leniency l'chadchila, since there's concern that perhaps dairy will spill on the hot plate, causing absorption. And if there's liquid underneath a meat pot placed there afterwards, the pot may become treif. Right? Remember we said there can be absorption if there's moisture. So if you happen to put a pot on there that has moisture underneath and some milk spilled on it, you're gonna ruin the pot. You're gonna treif up the pot. Right? The other problem there is when we talked about the burners, where anything that spills on the burners gets burnt by a real fire. Here it's not a real fire, so the things that spill are not going to get burnt up. You should not do it even sequentially. Even if you're going to clean it, he's concerned that there's still absorption. If you put a moist pot underneath there, there's going to be absorption. Now, my point is, since you don't use it for 7 days, it's clearly no sintam livkan. It's not a ben yomo. Anyways, b'mokum tzarach gadol yesh l'nakon et haplata mikol mamashos shloshgiach heitev shakderim atav shlachalvi lo tir tuva. That's why they allow it, because there's probably the concept that if you didn't use it for 7 days, it's livkan that adds to the leniency. Okay. Any comments, questions, issues? Those who want to read about sous vide, there's a further iyun section which we won't learn as a group. I'd like to start Hilchos Bishul Akum tonight, so we can get started in a new sugya, which we'll pick up, of course, next week. Mir Hashem. By the way, after this sugya of Bishul Akum, a separate shiur will be on Pasakum, Cholovakum, and Gvinasakum, which is very noyeg bizman hazeh, right? You know, bread, milk, and cheese that's not Cholav Yisrael or Pas Yisrael or Gvinas Yisrael. That means it's owned by a goy. All the ingredients are Jewish. All the ingredients are kosher, but it's not either the ovens aren't turned on by a Jew or it's owned by a non-Jew. What are the dinim regarding that? But before we get to that, we're going to learn about bishul akum, cooking.
Is there anything about wine? Are we covering wine anywhere?
We will be covering wine extensively.
Oh, good. Okay.
We will be covering wine. Yes, that's a big sugi in your day. Another one of the safeguards instituted by Chazal to prevent excessive intimacy with the non-Jewish population is bishul akum, which prohibits the consumption of certain types of food that are cooked by a Gentile. In this shiur, we will attempt to understand the basis for the enactment, the cases when it applies, and how it's applied practically today. The Mishnah Avodah Zarah lists different categories of food prepared by Gentiles that are forbidden for a Jew to consume. One of the items mentioned is foods cooked by a Gentile. Elu dvarim shel goyim asurim. The following things you may not eat, but ein isur and isur anah. You can do business with it. You can benefit from it. Chalav shechalavo goy. Milk that was milked by a Gentile. Ve'ein Yisrael ro'ehu. And a Jew is not watching him. Ve'hapat ve'ashemen shelahem. Their bread or their oil. U'shlokois. Shlokois refers to cooked foods. The Gemara initially attempts to prove that the prohibition is deraisa, but ultimately concludes that it's a rabbinic decree that was enacted by Chazal. So that we just learned the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah. So ask the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Ushlakois, but on Emili, how do you know that you're prohibited to eat foods cooked by a Gentile? Amrav Chibarava, Amrav Yechnon, they bring a pasuk, Amra Kra, Ochel Bakesef Tashbireni Ve'ochalti, Umayim Bakesef Titeli V'shasisi. This has to do with the Parsha Chukas when they asked Sichon to travel through their land to go to Eretz Yisrael. He said, listen, you'll sell me food and I'll pay it. You'll give me water and I'll pay it. So the drasha is Kamai. What kind of foods would we have bought from you? Foods like water. Because that's why it mentioned mayim. Ma mayim shelo nishtanu, af ochel shelo nishtanu. We would buy foods from you that were unchanged by cooking. Just like water is really unchanged by cooking. Ela me'ato chitin vason kloyos. What if they dried out or parched, or they roasted grains of wheat? Hachanami dasurin? Are you going to tell me that those are going to be usur? The chitem hachanami. So maybe you'll tell me because it's a kind of food that was not, that it was changed somehow by process, maybe you're going to tell me, yes, it's correct. It's also about Tanya, we have a brisa not like that. Chitin vason kloyos. If they took wheat kernels and they parched them to make them like corn nuts, mutarim. So what's this pasuk that you quoted me? Ela midrabanon. The gzeira is midrabanon. Ukra asmachta ba'alma. The pasuk is only an asmachta, something to lean on that the Chachamim use, but it's not midorais. So Tosfos suggests that even if the decree of shlokos is rabbinic in origin, it may have been an ancient decree, which explains why the Gemara initially thought that perhaps it was a doraisa. It should be noted that some Rishonim, such as the Rambam and the Ra'ah, disagree and hold that Pas Akum was in fact enacted earlier, since bread is the staple of a meal and is more commonly eaten. Therefore, there's more of a concern for intermarriage with bread than with cooked foods. Other Rishonim, like the Ritva, Rabbeinu Yonah, agree with Tosfos that the degree of Bishul Akum was first, before Pas Akum, but for a different reason. That initially the sages did not want to forbid the bread due to concern that the people would not be capable of complying, since bread was eaten so commonly. So Tosfos explains that this more ancient decree of Bishul Akum functions separately from the decree of Pas Akum, bread baked by a Gentile, about which we're going to learn in another shiur. Says Tosfos, Vashlokas Meranimili, on Rabbeinu Tam. Now, Dimi the boy Talmud Bishloko is that the more question this cooked foods business and the initial Havamina Ksavim Midoraisa, because why? Shema Gzera Kadmoniti, they thought it was a very, very early enactment. And the Lo Nigzer Mapasa was not a Gzera that was enacted at the same time of bread. Ushlokos in Yoni Tavshil. Shlokos is cooking, so says Rabbeinu Tam, Mitchila Gozra Lemitam Chasnos. The original Gzera was we wanted to avoid having intimacy with the Gentiles. So if you can eat their food, you're going to be invited over to their houses. But Valapas Loy Gozra. It wasn't into, everybody eats bread. You weren't just invited, there isn't so much closeness. Later on, Shammai and Hillel made a Gzeira ala Pas. So Tosfos is learning that Bishul Akum came first, then Pas. Avagadim must be some Tony Pas Mikavish, even though in the Mishnah it mentioned Pas before Shlokas, because Makam Shlokas Gzeira Kadmonit Yoter Haita. Cooked food enactment was before Pas. Ukshitirs Pas, when they lo yitir Shlokas me'aitai, no? They didn't permit shlokas. The pas of shlokas tre milin. They're completely different. So what was the specific reason that Chazal instituted the decree of Bishul Akum? According to Rabbeinu Tam, it was due to concern for chasnos, intermarriage. And this is the approach of Rishonim such as Tosfos Harid and the Ritva. But Agos Oshri, citing the Rashbam, says that the reason for prohibition is due to concern that Gentiles may feed the Jew non-kosher food, which presumably means that he may include non-kosher ingredients in the cooked food, even if the external appearance of the dish seems to be kosher. Right? It says that Agos Oshri, Rashbam calls B'Shem Rabbi Hussein to be shuli goy nesa mishum gzeira shem yachlenim goy davar tamei. And Rashi presents both reasons. In his commentary on the Mishnah that we quoted, he mentions the reason of intermarriage, while in his commentary on the Gemara, at the stage where the Gemara concludes that the prohibition was rabbinic, he writes that the reason is due to concern that the Gentile will feed him non-kosher. Right? So the Rashi in the Mishnah says, Shlok is called over Shabishul Goy, Vafilu B'Klitor, B'Kula Mishmum Chasmas. And then later where he says it's Midrabon and Shlo Yisrael Rogilet, so B'Maichel Unishtu, V'Yachlenu Davar Tomei. So next week, we will start with the Aruch HaShulchan, who will explain why Rashi needed to give us both reasons. And then we'll continue with the sugya of Bishul Akum. Any comments, questions, or aros?
All good.
Okay, so